I'm now very pleased to introduce our first session, The Future of Communications. We will hear from Jarl Mann, President Emeritus of NPR and former President and CEO of E, Brian Norgard, former Chief Product Officer of Tinder and founder of one of our portfolio companies, and Jesse Hempel, Senior Editor-at-Large at LinkedIn and host of the very well-received Hello Monday podcast. This session will be moderated by my colleague, M13's brand and communications partner, Christine Choi. As a reminder, please submit your questions via chat at any time throughout the session, and Christine will direct them to the panelists as time permits. Now, give us a moment as we welcome them on. In this little time purgatory, as our panelists join our Zoom stage, here we have Jesse. Hi, Jesse, how are you? Christine, I see Jarl.
Hey.
Wonderful, I'll hand it over to you, Christine.
Awesome, thank you. It's so great to see everybody. Wait, let me make sure Brian is on. Brian, can you hear us? Oh, good. Hey, we are so fortunate here at M13 to have, as Carter said, a fantastic community of practitioners and experts in their field for our founders to access. And this group is among the most distinguished. So I'm really, really excited for this conversation. There is so much to consider when it comes to communication. So my first question is actually about your learnings. Learnings are such an essential thing to make time for, especially as we think about and invest in the future. Each of you has pursued dynamic professional journeys across all forms of communication. Jarl, you've been a radio DJ, you got into TV, you founded E! Entertainment Television, and then you led NPR through impressive growth. Can you pick one format that you've learned the most from and just share a few quick insights on consumer behavior?
Okay, one format that I've learned the most from. I think the one that's most interesting and most top of mind right now has got to be just because it's of the moment, and that's podcasting. And when you think about it at its essence, it's really an old form. It's not a new form. The technology is new. The delivery of this content is new. But the notion of people telling stories, whether they're business stories or whether they're true crime stories or whether they're journalism, it's probably the oldest form that there is. When you go back to the Greek chorus, people chanting, telling stories around a fireplace or a fire pit. Australian indigenous people did the same thing. Shakespeare. This whole notion of sharing one's experience in a narrative form has just kind of blossomed, and it's a massive business these days. One that we were really excited about at NPR, and one that took advantage of a lot of the skill sets that our colleagues have had there. So to me, that was really interesting because it seemed to come out of nowhere, and it sounds like a new thing, and people think of it as a new thing. And I think the delivery is, but it's really not. It's an old form. It's the human voice with some production elements conveying a really compelling story.
Excellent. Thank you, Jarl. We're going to get into podcasts in a second, but I want to get into Jesse's journey, having started out in magazines, reporting about tech and all of its decision makers for Fortune and Wired. You are now the editor-at-large at LinkedIn, where you launched your podcast and LinkedIn's sole podcast, Hello Monday. Tell us what you have learned. Before we get into podcasts, tell us a little bit about what you learned through your professional journey.
Sure, I will. And thank you for having me, Christine. And I have to say, I'd be very happy to just listen to Jarl talk about podcasting and audio the entire time. But, you know, the 411 on me is that I always thought I wanted to be a writer, and I became a magazine writer. In 2003, they told me not to become a magazine writer because there'd be no jobs. And yet I managed to stay employed very happily as a magazine writer, writing about technology. But at some point, I was working for Wired, and I'd gotten to the point where I'd learned everything I needed to learn about craft, and I realized the value had switched, that there was more to learn about distribution than there was to learn about craft in media. And that is when I went to LinkedIn. It was 2018. So I've been at LinkedIn about a year and a half. The thing that I really wanted to learn at LinkedIn was, okay, I know how to make the media. How do I get the media to the right people and get those people to engage in conversation around it? That feels to me like the most interesting thing about this moment in time. And so I still do that in writing, but a lot of my time is spent on Hello Monday, our podcast, and I hope we'll get to talk a bit about that.
Yes, for sure. We're going to get into podcasts as a microcosm of everything that we are seeing. But first, I feel like Brian has a lot of insight as obviously a prolific product builder. Brian, you've built one of the fastest growing Facebook apps and also an ad tech startup that was bought by Fox Interactive. You were the GM of MySpace. You built a mobile messenger app backed by Kleiner Perkins, then acquired by Kinder. With your leadership, Tinder became among the fastest growing mobile revenue companies in consumer internet history. We're going to get into what you're working on next. But first, given the context of storytelling and distribution and connecting audiences with all of this access to information, can we first talk about privacy for a second? I'm very curious based on your experiences, and it kind of feels like Groundhog's Day, but our privacy is routinely violated and vulnerable. From your experience in creating platforms for video, photo sharing, chat, mobile, social, besides prevention measures, what are ways for companies to proactively build trust and also restore engagement?
I think, Christine, thank you also for having me. Thank you to the M13 family. Happy to be here. I love your background art. So let's start out. I think the key word you used is proactive. Right? Software companies in the past have been incredibly reactive. They were focusing on product development, technological development, scaling, and some of this trust and safety was an afterthought. It happened only, the software, the building of the software that helps mitigate this abuse only happens once the abuse occurred. And so I think what we've kind of finally got to in 2019, 2020 is this idea of you have to be in front of the wave. Not riding the wave, you have to be in front of it. And this is necessary for a lot of software companies, big, medium, and small. This used to be considered sort of a problem only for the big companies. And you could imagine, obviously, at scale, you're gonna have all sorts of crazy things going on, but now you're starting to see this flow downhill to small companies. So, there's more emphasis on best practices, more emphasis on understanding how to be in front of it, not behind it, or not being caught by it. And also this landscape is changing dramatically. What people used to do 5 years ago is old, is old news. They're doing new things, and so you have to keep up with the time. So it's never been a harder time to launch a community. It's never been a harder time to launch something where a lot of people participate together. But I think in the end, customers are undoubtedly going to be more safe than they once were. At the same time, there's so many people and so many new tactics. It is very much a cat and mouse game.
Yeah, so many considerations in communication, especially around community safety and privacy, as well as even like the exciting possibilities around exploring underutilized modalities like touch. But fundamentally, to Jarl's point, we are all talking about the sharing of human experience, even despite our vulnerabilities. What I find interesting is that all your paths have brought you to voice. So I'd love to spend just a few quick minutes unpacking podcasts, which I know we all want to talk about, and then discuss other voice applications. So Jarl, going back to NPR, can we get some more lessons around how NPR was able to, with your leadership, draw in, I believe it was 7.5 million listeners monthly because of NPR's podcast. And these were also younger audiences. Tell us about all of that.
Sure. Well, it's actually, the podcast reach is even higher. The network reaches about 31 million people every 7 days. Podcasting reaches on a monthly basis in the upper 20 million. So some of that's duplicative. But we had the advantage of being in the audio storytelling business for a long time, and the success and the kind of the genesis of podcasting at NPR began a lot earlier than my my involvement with the organization. It was a lot of, like any organization that's going to be successful has to experiment, has to try new things. And so NPR began I'd say 15, 16 years ago with the forum. And because the skill set, the talent was there, the technology was there, it was a much easier lift than for, I think, a lot of other companies. And so all that I did was just try to make sure we saw the wave. And so let's make sure we have the resources to take advantage of this. And that's what we did very successfully.
Well, and I think NPR is known for the quality of its content. And Jesse is also, I mean, I find that in my, in your craft as a journalist and also a podcaster, consistency in that quality storytelling is something that I've seen you execute across your magazine reporting as well as Hello Monday. Hello Monday is about work, right? That's what LinkedIn is known for, but the perspectives you bring in are not necessarily business gurus or executives. Tell us how LinkedIn got into podcasting with Hello Monday and how you approach community content, like giving people what we want, right? Which is learning how to be good at work, while at the same time making space for voices and stories and perspectives we wouldn't even know to consider.
Thank you for that wonderful tee up, Christine. I'm just going to have you introduce Hello Monday from here on out. So LinkedIn got into podcasts for the same reason that so many institutions and people are getting into podcasts. There's a sense that you got to be doing it. Maybe you don't understand it, but you better start, because 5 years from now, when podcasting is a much bigger industry, and believe me, it's my bet that it will be, we need to have experimented enough to know what our play is. And so Hello Monday is really continues to be the experiment for us to figure out what our play is. And I would just say just a couple of things about podcasting. I devour everything that NPR does. It is the pinnacle. It is the, NPR's podcasts are to audio what the New Yorker is to those of us who are literary. They're the best of the best. Most podcasting is not that. And that doesn't make it less valuable. That podcasting has many lanes, and we're still figuring out what they are. And I get tons of inbound from people ranging from peers, other journalists, to media institutions, to members who say, oh, I just made a podcast. Now what do I do with it? To that, I would say a few things. One is, it is difficult right now. It is always difficult, but particularly right now, to find an audience for your podcast. And there are a lot of not very good podcasts in the world. But also that scale isn't everything. That not every podcast needs a huge audience. What every podcast needs is a strategy, or else it's not worth doing. Because even if it's easy to do, it's more time than you think it is. Going back to, and Jarl, you can expand on this, but going back to blogging in 2004, right? Everybody needed to have a blog until somebody looked up and realized, well, nobody's reading my blog. And then it evolved and it became something else, and it became social media. It's kind of the moment we're at with podcasts. And if you're thinking about going into this, what you need to know is, like, who is the audience I want to reach? What does that audience need? And how do I need to serve it to them? So.
Such good points. Brian, I'm sure you are considering all of these things that both Jarl and Jesse have talked about as you are developing your new product. I don't know if you've spoken much about what you are building right now, but I'm very excited for you to share with this group a little bit around the product and, well, first of all, that it centers around voice. Can you first tell us what is so special about voice? Jarl teased it a little bit, but tell us a little bit more from your perspective about what is so special about voice.
Yeah, I mean, I think voice is an incredibly intimate format. The information density that, voice provides is incredibly rich. And you think about text messaging and, why certain things like emojis emerged and things like that. They were to try to put emotion inside of something that was really kind of cold, sort of ice cold. And voice is not ice cold. It is not all roses and butterflies, though. It can't be. It's very hard to, sometimes very hard to consume. It's hard to search and seek. And so voice isn't a perfect format. But, when I think about the evolution of what has been really blossomed and created over the last decade, we spent so much time and money and, incredible human capital hours evolving video and evolving images. And, you look at what we have now, it's unbelievable. I mean, basically someone in their bedroom can create something, that, you could have put on MTV, 20 years ago. But voice really kind of lagged. And, there wasn't a lot of innovation. And I think about 3 or 4 years ago, voice has been around for 20 years. At least podcasting as a format was created by Dave Weiner as a XML enclosure. And so you look at where we are today and you say a bunch of things are happening right now. We have AirPods and hearable devices that are starting to scale. And everyone loves this idea of like this cordless world where you can sort of snap in and put that device in your ear and you get this like amazing experience. You have people creating podcasting, so getting familiar with the format. And I also think you have a little bit of this hangover from text messaging. Right now, texting has become this incredibly transactional medium, and it's very, very hard to sort of, sometimes, these things where you pick up the phone, you say, oh, thank God you called. Like, I didn't know if you were mad at me. I didn't know if you were happy. You just can't read people. And so I think right now we're at this like really critical kind of Cambrian moment within voice where everyone is rethinking everything. They're rethinking the phone call, rethinking podcasting, rethinking how to share sort of more intimate or more sort of private one-to-one communication via asynchronous messaging. You've seen some of the stuff evolve around these sort of drop-in audio where people are doing almost these like live conferences during COVID with a couple of startups that have started to emerge. So there's a lot of innovation, and where I'm so excited is I'm excited to sort of put a light back on voice and bring it back to a level where people can use it how they want. That's the interesting thing. Kind of like, if you want to have a moment where you send someone a simple asynchronous message to tell them you love them, you can. If you want to say something to a broad group of people, you can. But it should all be done with, the same care that we've sort of come to love in, like a Pinterest or a Uber or a Tinder, where it's just one gesture. And right now, as everyone knows, getting a podcast up and stood up is very hard. It's not a simple thing, requires a lot of effort. But as you see, I think the great parallel is the blogging proxy. In 2004, you had to set up a WordPress and you had to host it and you had to understand how to, modify the text and underline and italicize. And all of a sudden Twitter comes out and bang, 140 characters, text only. And everyone now is like a mini blogger. And I think we're in the middle of that sort of evolution. We're not there yet, but podcasting, voice, all of this stuff is going to morph into a very simple consumer experience where all of us will look back and say, wait a second, what were we doing 10 years ago? And by the way, this is already happening in China in spades. China sends somewhere upwards of 14 billion voice messages a day. Now, Mandarin is a very different language stylistically than, say, English. But when you think about the data, this is coming and it's coming fast.
And to your point, and also to Jarl's point, this is not new. Jarl, you had a really interesting perspective on, I think it was Orson Welles and something he said about voice.
Yeah, well, it was Orson Welles, who most people know of as a filmmaker with Citizen Kane, which, by the way, I think is fascinating. A lot of people don't know this about Orson Welles. I think he wrote that when he was 21, and he directed and starred in it when he was, I think, 23. And before that, he did War of the Worlds. He also did stage, he did theater, but his favorite medium was always radio. And he said the reason he loved radio so much was it really required the audience, the participant, the listener, to be engaged with what was being done. And I think that still applies today. And it's even more so today, what Brian was saying. And that is that we now have this technology that is actually inside our ears. We can listen with smart speakers. We can listen with regular speakers. But so many of us experience podcasts or a lot of audio content inside our head. And so that intimacy that we've been talking about that is there to begin with, I think is even more prevalent with the technology.
Jesse, do you find that to be the case?
Yeah, I will say in the 15 years that I was a magazine writer, over time I cultivated people who appreciated my work and wrote to me about it and engaged with it. And in the year and a half that I have been a podcast host, I have discovered a much deeper connection to the work. Sometimes I'm even alarmed. I got Christmas presents this year. I went on vacation for a week and mentioned it on the pod. And multiple listeners emailed during that week to say, hope you're having a good vacation. And I realized that, and it's the same for me as a listener, like as a host for many people, especially during the pandemic, like I'm the pal, I'm the friend. And that is a really powerful opportunity in many different ways.
Speaking of opportunity, something I noticed around the time of COVID is that I think these pandemics, or the pandemic and all the crises that we are experiencing in this time, has resulted in social distancing, which can obviously be emotionally distancing, right? Social distancing is emotionally distancing, and so important to stay in touch. During COVID, a surprising thing happened. People turned to the telephone to stay in touch. Verizon CEO told CNBC that they are seeing double the amount of phone calls a day, 800 million, as the busiest day of the year, which is historically Mother's Day, and that the calls have even gotten longer, 33% longer. And Brian, like in beta-ing your exciting app, I've found that it's encouraged me to build my listening skills. And I've been listening with more intent than before. And given all the toxicity everywhere and all the confusion, listening to me is like a really important skill that I hope that voice and voice apps encourage more of us to do. So we've got a few minutes left, and I'm curious if there are any additional secondary and tertiary ripple effects that are driven by these very, very unusual times that we are likely to see in voice innovation and any other communication innovation. Opening it up to all of you.
I would just add to,
I'll go first with something very brief, which is it's not lost on me that we began the pandemic on Zoom. We wanted to see each other's faces. And the more time goes on, we recede from Zoom and for both work and pleasure, and turn to the voice as our way to actually feel connected.
Love it. Jarl.
and I would just add to what Jessie said and what her experience has been as a podcaster compared to her experience having written for many, many, many years. You know, I began my career as a disc jockey, and I couldn't have picked a dumber job, but as I say, it kind of worked out. You know, people do relate to that companionship. There's something about it. It's hard to explain. We can theorize about it. But I think as you continue to do the work on your podcast, Jessie, I think you're going to develop more and more and more of a loyal following. I don't think it's what happens at the beginning when you have the most loyal or the newest fans. I just think it's a very natural reaction. And we see it over and over again at NPR with our colleagues there. People really relate to that voice.
Jarl, also tell us about, you had an idea for Discovery, or you were bemoaning the fact that there's so much out there. Tell us a little bit about what you...
I don't think I have the idea. I have the problem, and I think it's a problem for everybody. I don't have the solution. But I think like many of us that like podcasting, and I haven't done any heavy research on it, although I know some has been done. I may follow, let's say, 50 podcasts. And I find before I go out for a mountain bike ride in the morning, I want to find something. I'm scrolling through, I mean, really terrific podcasts that I like listening to that I follow. And I don't want that episode. I don't want that episode. I don't want that episode. I would love to have some kind of recommendation on not the series, but on a specific episode with people that are like-minded so that I can find the real gems. I use Metacritic and Rotten Tomatoes for films. I've got this fabulous new one I've discovered from LitHub called Bookmarks for my book recommendations. I need that for podcasting. I waste a lot of time trying to find them.
Awesome. We are out of time, but Brian, do you have anything else you want to add? 30 seconds or less?
Yeah, no, I think I sort of echo a lot of the statements from Jarl and Jessie. You know, last but not least, I think what's the power of voice is also not just the human element, but the multimodal aspects of it. You can do so much. You can go mountain biking. You could take a walk. You can be, you know, listening, trying to manage the kids' homework with one AirPod in. And I think there's very few formats that allow that sort of flexibility. You're going to see a ton of people figure out amazing things to do with voice because of this idea that you can actually be doing multiple things at once.
I'm so excited to see what you do, Brian. Thank you so much to all of you, Jarl, Jessie, and Brian. This was so short. Thanks for listening, everybody. If you like what you heard, tune in to Jessie's Hello Monday, and also please sign up for more M13 events. Thanks, everybody.